let's turn some grey plastic green and talk through every single Orks box set that Games Workshop sells. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Orks. Today I thought we'd do a bit of a run through of Games Workshop's Orks range that they sell, talk through each one of the kits, and maybe just talk about how they stack up with each other a little bit, both in terms of interesting features of the box and what you get for your money, and rating them for a few bits such as how well they perform in game at the moment, and how many points you get per dollar invested. Hopefully this can act as a bit of a guide for people getting into Orks in 40k, and maybe help as a bit of a starting point for guiding future purchases. In any case, we'll go through the Orky kits one by one. We'll start with the troops and then move forward into other sections of the codex, and talk through price, in-game power, and any interesting details that you get in the kit. First up, and perhaps one of the most central Ork kits to start with, is Combat Patrol Orks, basically the discount option for getting into the faction, a bunch of units put together and sold at a bit less than Games Workshop would have charged for separately. The kit's £90, $150 or €120, will typically build you around about 530 points worth of greenskin goodness depending on what you load them out with, and perhaps as expected as a discount kit that does give you a pretty healthy amount of points per dollar invested, 3.5, which is better than most. The kit gets you a mega armoured war boss with the used chopper, 20 boys, 3 death copters and the death dread, almost all of which besides the dread are really quite recent Ork kit updates, very nicely realised in my opinion. Though as we'll get onto in a second, the Ork boys are the monopose variety, which does mean that you do have limited poses with assembling them and not your free choice of sluggers or choppers. In game, pretty much all the units are fine at the moment, perhaps not some of the single most standout units in the Ork Codex, but pretty much all of them are usable. And as discount kits go, it is fairly solid as an offering from Games Workshop, around about 42% off the miniatures contained within, which is more than they usually offer. Overall, I think if you're jumping into greenskins, it is a pretty reasonable starting point, a couple of troops, an HQ choice, and a couple of damage dealers, and quite a nice little balanced force. Moving on to the troops choice in general though, first up we have the boys, and weirdly enough they both sell the new kit and the old kit side by side. This one's the new set that comes in the Combat Patrol box, £30, $50 or €40, usually for around about 90 points worth of boys. Perhaps not the best points per dollar ratio out there, but at least now they went down in points, they're a bit more usable in game. They did change the look of the standard boy a fair bit between the old kit and the new. These ones are a bit less squat, and they do have some interesting dynamic poses going on. I think in general the reaction to the models was very positive. People do like the new appearance, but as mentioned a second ago, the kit is kind of an annoying one. It only allows you a certain amount of boys with shooters or with choppers, so it means that you're either going to be fielding a mixed squad or going to need to get multiple boxes to fill out a single unit with one weapon type. In terms of options in the box set, the knob can take a big chopper or a power claw, one can get either a big shooter or a rocket launcher, and then the rest are as pictured, 3 shooters and 5 choppers. I definitely weigh these up against the other kits and have seen people fielding a mix of them. The chaotic nature of Orks does mean that they look kind of fine all massed together in one big horde, some of them being a bit bigger and smaller even is kind of lore appropriate as well. The second kit of Ork boys does have some positives and negatives. They're definitely an older sculpt full of orks, and maybe the poses are a little bit more static and hunched over, but on the plus side you do get more of them for the money. £24, $38 or €31.50 is significantly cheaper than the newer kit, and you even get 11 boys in this one and not 10, so you get a much better points per dollar ratio. This kit has more options. Again, you get the same options on the knob and the special weapon ork if you want one, but otherwise there's enough parts to arm the rest with sluggers, choppers or shooters. You do get quite a pleasing amount of other bits within the kit though, a fair few random armour plates, a tank buster bomb and a bunch of other bits, plus you'll have lots of spare shooters or choppers for whatever you don't choose to assemble. I'd be tempted to arm them with slugger and chopper myself at the moment, and focus more on the melee rather than the shooting that they can't do very accurately. Just a bit of a shame that they're not so great in game in huge squads these days due to their morale. Of course we have more flavours of boys than ever before now. We now also have the Beast Snagger boys at £32.50, $55 or €42.50. These guys are basically Games Workshop's Savage Orks. After the last points updates they're now down to 10 points per model, and I do feel that they're pretty well balanced against the standard Orks. Getting the 6+ invul save and extra pip of strength I think is fairly reasonable for the extra cost that you pay. Even though I think that the name Beast Snagger is a little bit oddly specific in my opinion, I think that they've really nicely realised the whole savage orc aesthetic that's always been part of the orc backstory. Really nice for a horde of snake bites or whatever else. They've got loads of gear made from hides, pelts, and other bits of animals that they've brought down. In general, the squad is slightly monoposed though. Unlike the regular boys, they don't have the option of getting shooters or anything like that. One of them can choose to take a thump gun, and the knob gets a power snapper built in at base. Overall, cool and dangerous savage orcs. Again, perhaps a little bit on the low side in terms of points that you get for the money, but they are pretty effective in game at the moment, jumping out of kill rigs and things to mash up enemy troops. Just while we're on the subject of beast snaggers though, I thought I might just mention this kit from Age of Sigmar, currently branded as Savage Uruk Boys. It's not really meant to be aimed at 40k, but at the same time it is kind of interesting that you could pick up really quite a lot of greenskins for about the same cost as a standard box of beast snaggers if you did just want to field a whole load of boys slightly on the cheap. You don't get any sluggers in the kits, and all of the choppers that they have are basically made of stone, but if you did just want to field a feral orc horde, they could be an interesting option. They're only a little bit more expensive than the Beast Snagger boys, and you get 20 of them in the box rather than 10. If you do like the aesthetic, or you feel like converting a few slugger arms or something like that, they could be a real option, and get you a whole load more boys on the table for a bit cheaper. The models are a bit older and a bit basic, but they do have really quite a lot of fun orky poses going on. Finally, to round out the troops choice, we have the Gretchen, a little kit with a runt herd and 10 grots, one of the cheaper kits that Games Workshop offers in general at £14, $23 or €17. With the runt herd, you'd expect them to cost somewhere around 65 points, which given their cheap cost doesn't give them too terrible a points per dollar ratio, and in game they're not the worst to have around, just a very cheap unit that can do grunt work, hold down objectives, or maybe screen if you want them to. Gretchen aren't exactly meant to be the stars of the show within the Orc army. It gets simple and effective in my opinion. Pretty much monopose grots with the option to swap around the different heads, plus the runt herd who can opt to take a grabber stick or grot prod. Perhaps the biggest downside is that with this kit you're likely to wind up with far more runt herds than you really want to actually mine the grots. Might well be worth thinking about converting them into other basic boys, or give them some fancy combat weapons, or make one or two of them into knobs. Currently runt herds just aren't really all that effective, as it's not really usually worth spamming Gretchen en masse. Still though, quite a fun little kit. It's quite nice to get an entire squad from Games Workshop so cheap, even if the models are very little. Moving on to the elites next, and first up we have the Commandos, which come as a new Kill Team box set as of the Ork release last year. The box gets you 10 Commandos, plus a Distraction Grot and a Bomb Squig. It's £37.50, $60 or €50. Depending on how you equip them in game, it could be somewhere around 130 points, which makes the points per dollar not too terrible. I think it's pretty reasonable to have a unit or two in plenty of orc armies. They're hard to kill at range, and they allow you to forward deploy and get to work on objectives or get stuck into the enemy early. Blood Axes in particular will very much enjoy them. As Games Workshop kits go, the Kill Team kits tend to be some of the most fun and interesting out of any of them. This one has the option to build all sorts of different specialists. There's things like breacher rams, burners, and interesting heavy slugger variants here. You can choose to assemble them as those, or just go for sluggers and choppers throughout the unit, and the knob has a rather cool looking power claw as well. Overall, all round a good kit I think. Loads of cool characterful parts and upgrades, at least reasonably effective in game, and even not too terrible in terms of points per dollar, at least compared with some other orc kits. Mega Knobs next, and the kit for them is £40, $65 or €55. In the box you get 3 models plus a Grot Oiler, and you can choose to either assemble them as 3 standard Mega Knobs or make one of them into a big mech with Teleport Blaster and have the other 2 be squad fillers in another Mega Knob unit. Depending on which option you go for will depend on how many points you get out of the box. I think most people would usually be looking to run them as standard Mega Knobs. The Orky Elite are a bit more efficient since their points went down. In game I'd say they're usable enough, maybe not one of the absolute top standout Orc units, but still pretty solid. Each of the Mega Knobs comes with a decent amount of options. You can arm them all with claws, kill saws, and the various combi weapon options. And model wise, I think they do the job well of looking like orcs who have welded so many armor plates together that they're encased in a walking can. The mech with the teleport blaster I think is quite a cool miniature as well. I think the Gretchen model is pretty fun as well. I like his little welding mask and the squig that he's got hooked up to an oiling can. Next up we have the Burner Boys kits that can also be assembled as looters if you so desire. These 5 model Orky Elite units I think would generally be sold by Games Workshop a lot more expensively if they released today, but currently their price actually isn't too bad relatively, £21, $35 or €27. Certainly a lot better than things like those Necron Flayed ones, which are upwards of £30 for 5 similar sized models. Still though, their points per dollar ratios still aren't particularly great. Burners got really cheap here, in fact a little bit cheaper than I even recorded. I think it'd now be 55 points for them, including the custom Mega Blaster on the mech. Still a fairly bad points per dollar ratio as they're so cheap in game now. I think the Burners models do pretty well to look the part. They've all got their welding masks, one smoking a cigar, and they've got really quite big hefty orky flamethrowers. Really nice that they actually managed to fire D6 shots in 9th edition where they only had D3 before. One of them has to be assembled as a spanner who can either be armed with custom Mega Blasters, rockets, or a big shooter. In game at the moment, they're a pretty reasonable unit. I'd rank them fairly medium for the Ork Codex. They do work against enemy infantry, but likely need a transport. The dual build option for the Burners are the Looters. As they cost a few more points, you do at least get a few more points on the table out of the kit if you field them that way, though I must admit their in-game power just isn't particularly standout right now. Their autocannon equivalent profiles are kind of ruined by things like Armour of Contempt or -1 damage, so there's a lot of targets they're just not that great into. Perhaps one of the advantages of getting the kit though is that you can use all the spare parts to upgrade some boys into the other set that you didn't build. So you could take the Burner Boys parts and use the extra burners to augment some regular Ork Boys, and that way you have both elite units. Models wise, I think that the Looters are pretty fun as well. Really quite like to see the looted enemy technology that they've got going. They've got a Tau Fusion Blaster on one of them and an Imperial Las Cannon on another. Quite fun to see a whole load of bits being welded together freestyle by the mechs and just seeing what happens. Moving on, we've got the knobs, £21, $35 or €27 for a set of 5. They come with an ammo runt as well. Pretty flexible and nicely executed Orky elites, typically costing maybe around 85 points in game, giving them a middling points per dollar ratio. I'd rank them kind of middling for in-game strength as well. In general, I think you're usually going to be better off with boys, but they're not terrible for concentrating force, like say inside a truck or something. I feel like they can hit the enemy on a fairly equivalent kind of level. You do get a fair amount of fun bits with the kit. You have 3 different combi weapon options, some cool big choppers, and power claws and a kill saw in effect as well. They are also a kit that's been in various different Ork bundles for a really long time now. They often seem to be one of the ones that get discounted, so it might well be worth looking on eBay to see if there's anything going there cheaper. Next up we have the Tank Busters, one of the only resin relics of the entire Ork range now, £28, $47 or €37. That gives them a fairly bad points per dollar ratio, and in game I'd rate them as medium. They are efficient enough when they do have vehicles to shoot at, but when they don't, things get a little bit lackluster, particularly if they have to move. The kit itself is one of their fine cast resin ones, so it does have its issues. They're generally not as nice to work with as plastic. The models are all kind of monopose, and perhaps out of any of the Ork kits at the moment, they're the ones that I'd say most need an update and upgrading into beautiful plastic. The ones that you get in this box have a couple of bomb swigs with them. There's one guy with a tank hammer and one with a pair of rocket pistols. If you need more models in the unit, it might well be worth using any spare rockets that you have from boy kits. That could give you a few more tank busters converted from standard boys. As kits go though, due to being resin and really quite old miniatures, I'd say they're one of the less desirable kits in the Ork range at the moment. Moving on to fast attack, and first up we have the Death Copters. These mad flyboys are kind of priced in line with Games Workshop's other bike kit, £37.50, $60 or €50. That gets you 150 points worth of flying helicopter in game. Not actually too terrible on the points per dollar front, and in game they are pretty useful, particularly if you're playing Speed War. Ork players have certainly waited a good long time for these to be reimagined in plastic following the Black Reach set that came out in 5th edition. These new ones very much follow that aesthetic of the popular Black Reach Deathcopters, somewhere half between a bike and a mini helicopter, a bunch of rockets mounted at the front, and one of them has a custom Mega Blaster and Big Bomb. I don't believe that there's an option to change that out within the kit. Otherwise, it's kind of interesting that these guys have no flying bases. They're basically mounted halfway up terrain pieces and things. GW does seem to have been trying to release fewer kits with flying bases at the moment. In game, I'd say they're fairly good all-rounders, very fast, a reasonable amount of firepower, and surprisingly dangerous in melee with those spinning blades. Kind of fun that they can deep strike and then use that ramming speed one to get very reliable charges. They can certainly hit the enemy out of nowhere. Next up, we've got the Storm Boys, 5 orcs with rocket packs strapped to their backs, £21, $35 or €27 for 5. There'd be 60 points in game if you give the knob a power claw. though that still doesn't add up to particularly impressive amount of points for the cost. Again, really quite fun and very orky models, never mind fancy jump packs or anything of the other races, these ones just simply strap a rocket to your back and off you go. And there are a few very fun details within the kit, such as a guy with a stick bomb clasped between his teeth, and you can also build a little storm grot holding on to one of the other boys' backpacks, which I think is a cool little detail. In game, I certainly think that they're useful enough. They're boys that will almost be guaranteed to make melee with their long threat range, and can be pretty handy for just annoying enemy units, blocking them, tying them up, or doing actions and objective type things, never mind their actual damage output. I'd rate them as a pretty solid unit for Orks at the moment. Next up, we've got the Squighog boys, £37.50, $60, and €50. In this kit, you get 3 standard Squighog boys, one rather awesome grot riding a bomb squig, plus a knob with a smasher squig, the one that makes a big hitting charge for a whole ton of mortal wounds. I did find it a bit weird that you buy these all as one bundle together, yet actually in game you have the smasher squig actually as a separate unit, and the Squighog boys just basically go off and do their own thing if they want to. At least compared with a fair few other of Games Workshop's bite type kits, you do get a rather decent amount of plastic in this one. Quite cool that you get a mini character as well as the Squighogs, and appearance wise I think that they really look the part, maybe halfway between old classic style Ork boar boys and the standard orange squigs that we know and love so much. I think they're really fun miniatures, particularly the grot on the bomb squig, and they look fairly dynamic, with them just about to thrust those sticker spears, presumably into some big beastie that they're trying to bring down. As kits go, they are fairly monopose, they just basically make the models that you can see and not much else, and currently in game both units are really quite solid, particularly the Squighog boys seem to be in a lot of competitive Ork lists right now, and the Smasher Squig is quite a nice lurking threat to bash the enemy with a bunch of mortal wounds as he charges in. If you prefer the steeds mechanical and hurtling towards the enemy even faster, there's the Warbiker mob, £30, $50 or €40 for 3 of them, perhaps around 85 points in game, again if you give the knob a power claw, though it still doesn't add up to being particularly efficient in terms of money per points. The kit's kind of a medium-aged one for Orks at this point. I think it hails from 5th edition sometime. It was maybe a slightly more simple one by current Games Workshop standards at the moment. Options-wise, the knob can take a power claw or a big chopper, really quite a big cool one with a chain attached, and the others have a few more speed freak appropriate melee weapons such as spiked or cog-toothed clubs. In game they're usable enough, I'd say somewhere between medium and strong, really quite fast expendable units that are fairly tough to take out. They can put out a fairly decent flying hail of lead if they are in a speed war, and do quite well in bad moons or freebooters. In general, with the new war changes, I feel like Squighog boys probably have the edge over these, but they're still pretty solid nonetheless. While we're on the subject of Games Workshop's kits and value, I thought I might just quickly mention Element Games, one of the things that helps keep these videos coming quite so regularly. If you are looking to pick up Warhammer kits within the UK, it's well worth checking out one of the discount retailers. I've linked Element down in the video description below, though there are others. Element Games is mainly UK based, though there are plenty of other alternatives abroad. They give 15% off Games Workshop's miniatures, including the vast majority of their Ork range, and if you do happen to click on the link in the video description and buy anything after it, a small amount of the purchase does go to help support the channel. It doesn't cost you any more if you do buy something from them through that, so if you do happen to live in the UK and you are buying something anyway, can just be a way to help support Auspex Tactics while also getting some money off your miniatures. In any case, check out the link down below if you're interested. Back to the Ork kits now, and next up we have Games Workshop's various Orktober buggies, perhaps one of the biggest and most extensive replacements of a kit that Games Workshop's ever done, taking the old War Buggy and War Track and replacing them with none other than 6 different buggies, each one pretty unique in its feel and armament. All the buggies are around £32.50, $55 and €42.50, and they generally aren't amazing on the points per dollar ratio, they are 100 points or less. The models are kind of an interesting one, they really are quite unique little dioramas of Orky miniatures, though they are maybe just a little bit prescriptive and not very customizable, which I do maybe find just a little bit ironic for Orky vehicles that are very heavily customized and kind of welded together from scrap. They do look really quite awesome when they hit the tabletop though, really quite fun Mad Max type Ork themes, and often sit at pride of place in a Speed War type list. Going through them individually, and first up we have this Rocket Truck Squig Buggy. This one's an Orky food truck that fires explosive squigs out of a couple of different launchers, plus has some saw blades jutting out each side of it. The squigs are pretty fun, although this thing has had a bit of a turbulent history. When the Ork Codex dropped in 9th edition, it suddenly became pretty much worth always spamming 9 of them, and Games Workshop has since made several rules changes that have made it a bit more limited. Still not terrible, but with the barrage nerf, they are a bit lackluster in terms of ignores line of sight shooting. The Megatrack Scrapjet is basically a massive jet engine with a pilot. I kind of like the theme that they've gone for this one as kind of a fighter ace, but driving a very fast vehicle on the ground. He shoots with a bunch of big shooters, some rocket launchers, and also hits pretty hard in combat with the drilled nose of the jet engine itself. In game, I'd argue it's probably one of the best ones, even though it's a bit more expensive at 100 points. Kind of hard to argue with extreme speed, decent firepower, and solid enough melee all in one buggy. Otherwise, we've got the custom booster blaster, a roadster with a great big rivet cannon and some burning exhaust that can actually be surprisingly dangerous to infantry when up close. I do quite like this one. It's quite cheap for the amount of firepower that it can put out. It really can be quite dangerous to enemy troops. The Boomdakis Nazwagon has the high rate of fire mech special on the top. This one's kind of an armoured dune buggy with a Gretchen strapped to the hood. Plus the Ork on the back isn't content with just firing away on that gun, he also seems to need to throw in some Molotov burner bottles as well. In game kind of alright, but I'd say not super standout, at least it's quite cheap. Finally there's the Shock Jump Dragster, basically an Orky Formula 1 race car with a great big lawnmower type blade out the front. This one packs some fairly reasonable anti-tank fire with the custom shock rifle, and I do quite like the way that in game it can teleport across the field jumping from one place to another. Potentially can be handy enough to jump behind the enemy, if that does make more sense late game. It's maybe a bit meta in the Speed Mob Army of Renown, as that means that you can still fire its guns. Overall, I do really quite like the variation between all the buggies. Quite nice that you can have a little fleet of them where they all have their own character. I do feel that as kits though, they are just a bit on the expensive side for fairly light vehicles. Heavy support next, and we'll start off with a great big squig drawn kill rig or hunter rig. Pretty much the centerpiece of the fairly recent Ork Beast Snagger release. Games Workshop does quite like their big expensive centerpiece kits. This one's £80, $130 or €105, so really quite a big pricey one. If you build the kill rig, it's 190 points in game, giving it a fairly awful points per dollar ratio unfortunately. Though model wise it is really quite a big and detailed one, and it is quite powerful in game between all the various things that it does, from being a transport, a fast melee unit, a shooting unit, and a psyker all rolled into one. The thing is kind of like a mini diorama, a whole load of beast snagger orcs basically tooling up to go looting and I guess bring down some big monsters. One guy driving, one guy with a harpoon, one with a great big gun, and a couple with spears to stick anything that get too close. As centerpieces go, I think a lot of people do like it, though it has divided opinion maybe a bit more than some perhaps. I think a few people just feel it looks a little bit cartoony or toy-like maybe. I feel like perhaps the way that it's painted might have helped with that feel just a little bit perhaps. Still overall pretty cool and detailed, really quite nice to use in game at the moment as well, as it's kind of hard to go too far wrong with. Quite a snazzy and fun unit option in the Ork range. You do also have the option of building the kill rig as a hunter rig. That one would basically mean that you also get the Warboy as well, which you could field on foot. Technically this does actually get you a few more points than building the kill rig outright, due to the Warboy being kind of expensive on foot, but unfortunately I think that both options are just kind of inferior to fielding the kill rig on its own merit. The Warboy just seems better if it's attached to a kill rig to be honest. The psychic powers maybe aren't super standout anyway. And I feel like for the hunter rig, the slightly cheaper points cost and slightly bigger transport capacity just maybe isn't quite enough to lose those psychic powers and the big gun. If you prefer your big transport and gun tank non-squig drawn, then you could think about the Battle Wagon kit, which also builds the Bone Breaker and the Gun Wagon, which are kind of minor variants. The Battle Wagon kit's £65, $110 or €85, and again is kind of comparable with the kill rig in terms of points per the money. Ork big vehicles do tend to be a bit cheaper than some perhaps due to not being manned by particularly skilled crew, and perhaps that does just lend themselves to being a little bit cheap on the points cost side. The Battle Wagon kit's really quite a fun and flexible one. There's a lot of options for flexible guns that you could add or remove, a big kill cannon at the top, plus a secondary big gun, a few bolt-on big shooters, the grabbing claw and the death roller, and you can choose to have an ard case at the back if you want as well. In game at the moment, the standard Battle Wagon does seem by far the best, cheap and effective, fairly fast and fairly tough. It's pretty good with boys, and basically most of the Orky elites that have dangerous weapons but aren't really tough to take out. A cheap one with a death roller seems to be the best thing to go for in game right now. Otherwise, for alternate rules for basically fielding the same thing is the Bone Breaker. It's kind of the same unit but with a few more limited options, plus some extra attacks when it charges with that big death roller. I just filled it as the standard battle wagon at the moment, to be honest. I'm just not sure that the datasheet really adds all that much value for the extra cost. I do think that the death roller really is quite fun and brutal though. It's all very orky just to be enjoying running over those space marines with a great big steamroller essentially. Finally, there's the gun wagon variant, again pretty much a different way that you can fill the standard battle wagon. The gun wagon makes the standard kill cannon a little bit more efficient, but just really not efficient enough for the points cost in my opinion. In general, I think you're always going to get more value out of the death roller equipped one, even if it's just as a countercharge threat. Next up, we've got the flash kits. Orky Elites at £35, $60 or €45, essentially knobs with snaz guns, again cobbled together, expensive tech that costs a lot of teeth and spits a whole load of dangerous lead in the general direction of the enemy. The models themselves, they've really tried to exemplify Ork pirates and raiders, some cool glyph plates at the back, and I quite like the way that their captain is basically giving himself a skull and crossbones and a pirate hat. They feel very freebooters and like they're the sort of orcs that are be manning raiding vessels. The kit doesn't really have too many major options with how you can build them differently, and in game they are a little bit mediocre at the moment. I feel like their damage output really suffers from them being heavy weapons. Even their Gip Finders I don't think quite make up for this. Orky Walkers next, and first up we have the Death Dread, £35, $60 or €45, and this guy does come in the Combat Patrol box as well as in the previous Start Collecting one, so it could be one that you might be able to find discounted on eBay or something a bit cheaper if you're lucky. The Death Dread is an ambitious orc that's been welded into a can permanently, and has a whole bunch of fairly savage close combat weapons and can mount some scary guns. The datasheet itself is pretty flexible, though the options on the kit are a tiny bit limited. You either get 4 melee armor options, or some of the ranged loadouts. The ranged weapons you only have a maximum of 2 of in the kit of each, so you'd have to convert if you wanted any more. In game I'd say it's kind of okay, maybe medium-ish in power, a little bit of ranged fire and a little bit of combat. It is kind of on the slow side though, and maybe not super optimal compared with some other choices. Another option are the killer cans, again the same price as the Death Dread at £35, $60 or €45, basically little versions of the Death Dread but with Gretchen pilots instead. They do a little bit better on the points per dollar front, maybe being around 120 points in game, and in battle they're alright, a bit of range, a bit of melee, but also they get quite a lot of ramshackle wounds on the board, which can make them a bit of a pain to slog through for certain units. The cans are smaller than the Death Dread, but still you get a reasonable amount of plastic for the money from Games Workshop in my opinion. I feel they do pretty well to capture the Ork Ramshackle Walker aesthetic. Really not a bad option if you do want to bulk out your Orky force with a bunch of cheap vehicles and get at least a reasonable amount of plastic for your money, at least by Games Workshop standards. Next up we've got the mech guns, and these are kind of notorious for being one of the more expensive Games Workshop kits, £32.50, $55 or €42.50, and with them being so cheap in game, they do actually break the 1 point per dollar milestone, as you only get around 45 points worth of gun in the kit. They definitely do feel a little bit on the pricey side. You basically get one gun that can swap out the barrel, plus a bunch of grot attendants. The gun itself isn't too bad in 40k at the moment. I think having a few of those in the backfield with custom mega cannons is a pretty reasonable addition to most orc lists. You just don't really want to spam them due to their bad leadership giving you a real chance of the other ones running away. If you want multiple of these, I'd strongly consider converting them. There's certainly a kit that you can potentially stretch. Maybe just get the one mech gun and combine it with a truck kit, and I've seen people be able to manufacture another 3 or so more from that. But just in general, you could just be a bit trigger happy with some plastic art. It is basically an orc gun that's cobbled together from bits of scrap, and that gives you a lot of opportunity for conversion. At least it's only kind of optimal to have a couple of them at the moment. It was a bit ridiculous when genuinely one of the stronger orc lists could be running 18 of these in the previous edition. That did feel a bit silly. Speaking of the truck, the standard issue Orky Transport is next, £30, $50 or €40, a cheap flatbed transport vehicle. Again, not so great in terms of points for the money, but kind of alright in game as you can give Orc Boys the Truck Boys upgrade and get them zoomed across the board at double speed. Kit wise, it is quite a flavourful one I think. There's options for the wrecking ball and boarding planks on the sides, and certainly looks the part as a ramshackle Orc transport. I would be aware that these things can take a bit of a while to paint. They've got a lot of exposed surfaces, so it can take a bit longer than something with nice flat armor panels like vehicles from other factions. Next up we've got the Orky Flyers. The Dakajet kit also builds plenty of the others, the Wasp-Bomb Blaster Jet, Burner Bomber, and Blitzer Bomber. And for one Orky warplane, it's $47.50 or $80 or €62.50. At the moment, if I were to get an Orky plane, I'd probably use it as the Wasp-Bomb Blaster Jet. That one's 230 points when upgraded, but does hit with an absolute ton of firepower between the Smasher guns and the heavy teleport blasters. That one also has the collecting advantage of costing a lot of points as well, so it's actually better on the ratio side than quite a lot of Ork kits. Model-wise, I think it does quite a good job of catching the iconic Ork fighter bomber type look. Cheap and effective Ork planes, just covered with guns, flying towards the enemy with reckless abandon. And there is quite a lot of scope for customising the plane a bit how you want to look it, with all the options in the kit. This one's the Dakka Jet with the super shooters attached, maybe the most default version. And then these three are the other builds for the plane, the mech-piloted Wasp Bomb on the left, then the Burner Bomber, then the Blitzer Bomber on the right. There are a whole bunch of fun features between the different planes, different sort of shaped tails, drop gunners with various flavours of big shooter, and different mounts for the missiles and guns on the planes. You could definitely have different options even if you built two of the same variant. In game I'd be most tempted to go either for the Dakka Jet or the Wasp Bomb. Both of those are really quite efficient compared with the other two at the moment, I feel. Moving on, we've got everyone's favourite walking trash can that is the Stomper, £80, $130 and €105. This one again is definitely on the more pricey side of Ork kits, but to be fair you do get a lot of plastic and a lot of points for that cost, far more so than say the Kill Rig. This great big effigy of Gorkor Mork really is a pretty enormous kit by Games Workshop standards. It towers far above something like an Imperial Knight, despite costing a fair amount less. Model-wise, it's really quite a big fun centerpiece for the faction. I really quite like a few of the details, like the Gretchen banging on it with hammers. It's got some transport capacity in the belly of the beast, plus it's got an absolutely enormous chopper and enormous gun. In-game, despite having a hefty points cut, it still isn't particularly efficient unfortunately. I'd still say it's a bit of a liability in a list, and particularly with all the nasty anti-tank going around in 9th edition. If you did just want to fill out the points for an Ork army on the relative cheap side though, this one has the single best points per dollar out of everything in the Codex I think. Far better than even the Combat Patrol if you just want to get points of Ork on the table. Overall I think it's quite fun as an absolute massive Ork centerpiece. Not going to be the most efficient thing in the world most of the time, but certainly good value on other metrics, the amount of plastic for the cost, and how many points you get in game. Also recently moved into the Ork Lord of War slot are the Gorkanauts and the Morkanauts. They are a much more recent and perhaps more detailed kit than the Stomper, but I do find it kind of interesting how they cost literally the same price as the thing, despite being less than half the size. In game, these things have stats that aren't so dissimilar from something like an Imperial Knight right now, but unlike the Knights, just don't really have quite as much support. Unfortunately, like the Stomper, they are really on the niche side, not going to be taken in most competitive lists at all. Models-wise, they're a fairly squat and stompy Orky walker. They're perhaps just a little bit lucky on the dumpy side, but that's probably because they have that enormous belly which can actually transport a few models. And then you've got the choice between the more boss-flavoured Gorkanaut or the big mech piloted Morkanaut, depending on whether or not you want a bit more melee might and a whole ton of shooting barrels. Or if you want the Morkanaut with its custom force field to protect nearby creations, plus its great big mega zapper. Again, a pretty fun Ork heavy walker these. It would be nice if they were a little bit more effective in game. A couple of Orky fortifications next, and first up we have the Big Ed Boss Bunker. Really quite a fun little release this one, an Orky fortification shaped like a giant Ork head with some massive teeth going on. It is a bit on the pricey side at £45, $75 or €60. For points per dollar it is again one of the worst things in the Codex, actually almost rivaling the mech guns, but it is quite a fun model to have lurking within an army, and you can do a few interesting things with it in game, such as dropping it in with a bunch of tank busters and hopefully vaporizing some enemy armor. Not really a lot of huge options on the model, other than whether or not you put the shouting pole at the top and how many big shooters you choose to bolt on, but at least as a bit of a terrain piece you might be able to make use of it both as a terrain option and also as its own datasheet if you wanted to. The other Ork fortification is the Mechboy Workshop, £35, $60 or €45, again fairly cheap on the points side of things, and a bit of terrain that you could double up either as using its datasheet or as battlefield terrain as the mood took you. Again, I feel like this one's really quite a fun piece that kind of tells a little story alongside the miniature. You can just imagine an Ork mech hanging out here, bolting together all those wheels and bits of tracks and things, making some new creations. There's a winch that's lifting an engine into place, a great big drill, and a big clawed grabber thing, plus a tool bench with a whole load of spanners and saws and things hanging up. In game, I can't say I'm a massive fan of the datasheet to be honest. I feel like it's a bit much for just allowing some extra army construction, plus the option of having a mech put on some custom jobs onto vehicles in the middle of a game. It just maybe feels a bit clunky. Still though, quite a nice little terrain option, and quite a cool thing to have in the Ork range in general. HQs next, and the Orks do have a fair amount of characters going on. We'll take a look at a few of them in a bit more detail, and then go through some of the rest a little bit more quickfire. First up, we've got the Deathkiller Wartrike. This guy was released alongside the October buggies, maybe as a bit of an update on the War Boss on Warbike datasheet that used to be in the game before. You can still get that with Forge World, as we'll mention in a second, but it does feel like the spiritual successor of that. Like the other October buggies, he's £32.50, $55 or €42.50. Costs around 120 points in game, so could be worse on the points per dollar front, and basically he's your go-to choice if you need to lead a speed war into battle and unlock all the goodness that brings, like the extra Daka shots and extra AP. I feel like the model itself is a pretty menacing one, a masked Orky driver brandishing a shotgun, then a rather large and hulking boss with that snagger grapple claw, who does pack a fairly hefty punch in combat. Again, definitely goes in with the Mad Max theme of those buggies, and maybe more of a choice that you might take just literally to lead a speed war rather than massively for his own stats, though he certainly can lend a hand in combat pretty nicely. Otherwise, for the bigger and more standout HQ kits, we have the big boy himself, Ghazghkull Thraka, the Lord of the War, £42.50, $70 or €55 from Games Workshop. That's really quite a massive and pretty awesome character kit. You also get his dedicated banner waver Makari, and it actually means that he costs 350 points in game, including him, and it actually gives him a points per dollar ratio that rivals the Stomper as one of the best ways to get more points into an Ork army on the cheap. His model is a pretty recent one, coming out alongside that Saga of the Beast story they had from the end of 8th, and in general his miniature went down very nicely indeed. Seems like a pretty fitting update for the boss, hulking enormous and threatening, an enormous 4-barreled shooter, and a very mighty and dangerous looking power claw. In game he's also very usable on the tabletop as well, often forming a pretty staple part of goth lists as a big and dangerous unit to deal with. His melee is pretty fearsome, he gives out good combat buffs to units nearby, and he does have that annoying rule where you can't kill more than 4 wounds of him in a single phase unless you have certain special rules of your own. In general, I think it's just a pretty reasonable all-round pickup for an Ork army at the moment. A really nice model, gets you a lot of points on the table, and also pretty effective in an actual game of 40k too. Going through the other HQ choices though, first up we have the war bosses. When I made the slides for this, there were 3 options. Unless I'm missing something though, I believe they might have taken down that last war boss with the big chopper on the right there. So now for standard bosses, you've only got the choice of the war boss and the mega armor on the left, or the war boss with attack squig and the power claw in the middle. To be fair, the remaining options both are really quite nice plastic kits. The war boss with mega armor has got that fun Gretchen with a big shooter on his shoulder, and he has the absolutely enormous chopper as well. I think the miniature looks pretty nice. I feel like the only downside for him is that it would have been really nice for them to make a power claw option in the box, just seeing as a war boss with a power claw and mega armor is such an iconic choice for Orks. Otherwise, now for just the standard on foot choice, there's the war boss with the power claw and attack squig, which was originally released as Grok Face Ripper. He's a little bit cheaper, and another pretty reasonable choice if you want to have a standard cheaper war boss on foot, maybe taking something like the Killer Claw for some extra combat might. The big chopper boss was a bit of an older miniature. I believe he was one of the Finecast resin ones, a range that Games Workshop is slowly getting rid of bit by bit. I guess if you want a big chopper war boss, it'd be convert from the middle one now, though I must admit with Games Workshop standards of no model no rules, it might be on borrowed time. Otherwise, for more Beast Snagger flavoured war bosses, we have 2 different types of Beast Boss. There's the big and dangerous one on the Squigosaur, a scary cavalry type war boss that can either build the special character Mosrog Scragbad or the standard beast boss on a Squigosaur, both of which really are quite lethal in game, on top of the regular war boss's stats having a whole load of chompy attacks from the Squigs. I do quite like the almost shark-like appearance of the Squigs, and the miniatures themselves really are quite big and hulky on the tabletop, definitely looking the part as leaders. In game, if you do just want a standard boss on the field, these guys are a pretty reasonable choice, certainly a melee capable unit that can call the war, and then have a good job at beating the face off anything that comes close. The standard beast boss comes with a claw and a beast chopper, plus he kind of mirrors the mega boss a little bit with a shooter on his shoulder that's targeted by a targeting squig. He very much takes the savage orc type style of the beast snagger boys and dials it up to 11, all sorts of beast hides, bones, and various trinkets adorned all over him. I feel like for in-game rules, the Squigosaur mounted one is generally going to be the way to go. I guess this guy could ride in a kill rig though if it was desired. Some mechs next, and we did talk about the Mega Armoured one that you could get as part of the Mega Nob set. Besides that, we've got the big mech with the custom force field. He's another fine cast resin model, which can have a few issues compared with plastic, but quite nice in game as a nice cheap option to give some invul saves to nearby orcs. I quite like his spanner axe combo that he's got going on, though I think he is a model that you could potentially convert out of other bits of scrap. Just get a whole load of fancy goblins together that looks like it could represent a force field, and stick it on the back of a knob with a lot of bionics, and you're probably good. They also have the Mini Beck, which is a very cheap character in the Elite section. He is a little bit expensive, though he is an individual plastic kit, £16, $27 or €21. He comes with a custom Mega Slugger for a little bit of close range punch. Then there's the Ork Big Mech with Shock Attack Gun. He was pretty much the terror of 8th edition, though is maybe a bit more tame now. Another model that really epitomises Orc craziness, suck in the runts and then teleport them to somewhere presumably inside the enemy that you're trying to kill. Again, a fun model that tells a little orky story, even if not particularly pleasanter one. Pain Boy's next, and for the generic options, the standard Pain Boy with his claw full of medical implements has also acquired a Beast Snagger alternative. The Beast Snagger Pain Boss is a bit more expensive. He comes with a sinister and creepy looking little grot orderly, and also has replaced his legs with big bounding ones to try and help him keep up with the Squighog boys. The Orc docs really are quite mad and fun themselves. There's an IV swig on the Pain Boss, plus a whole load of injecting syringes on both of them. Definitely not the docs that you really want to visit, unless you've seriously been bashed up. The standard Pain Boy was in the Ork Start Collecting box for a good amount of time. There's probably a fair amount of them kicking around on eBay. There's at least a small chance that a few of them might be going around at a small discount compared with what Games Workshop sells them for. Otherwise, there's the Death Skull character Mad Dog Grotznik, a fine cast resin miniature unlike the plastic of the other two. He is a lot cheaper if you just like to represent a Pain Boy on a budget, though I would say that the miniature is definitely showing its age compared with the other two. Not quite as fun or detailed, but still really quite a creepy orc medic. Finally, to round off the character choices, we've got a few more. Weird Boys are pretty solid in game, jumping orcs around the board with Dad Jump or giving them extra attacks, or empowering bosses with Fists of Gork. This one does look pretty deranged, as he's managing to pull his Gretchen handlers away from him. He is another one of the older Finecast resin kits as well, so he doesn't come in plastic. Otherwise, there's Zogrod Wartsnagger. He's a newer character, and is perhaps surprisingly expensive for who's basically a fancy Renters with some big hair. I do find it a bit weird that he costs more than a war boss at £27.50, $45 or €35. He does have some good backstory going on, training up his grots to be super runts, though he isn't particularly good in game, at least at the moment. Finally, there's the Orc Knob with War Banner. You could probably convert one of these and without too much difficulty from a standard knob plus some glyphs or something. He can make the orcs hit a little bit better in combat with +1 to hit, that isn't quite as restricted as the boss's one to just core units. Still again, probably not stand out in my book in terms of orky characters. That's the Orky range from Games Workshop, though I thought it would be good just to take a quick look through the various Forge World options, as they do contain some pretty iconic units for the orcs like the Squigoths. Obviously Forge World resin prices are on a complete other level even compared with Games Workshop's ones, so pretty much luxury buys, and a lot of people do turn to third parties for lookalikes. For some of the biggest and most iconic ones, there's two different flavours of Squigoth, one a gargantuan one that's over £300 but I think looks really quite cool, and a more standard size one that is maybe just a little bit static and less cool as a miniature overall. There's the Ork Kill Tank, which was doing okay towards early 9th edition in terms of rules and things, a big heavy vehicle with a whole load of shots. Really quite a brutal looking looted war machine, and to be honest I think that if you wanted just a bit of a conversion project, you could probably manage something not too dissimilar with a bunch of plasticard and orc glyphs. Perhaps some of the most fun Forge World options are the Grot tanks and the Grot Mega Tank. Really quite cute little mini tanks that aren't much bigger than a standard infantry model from some other factions. You've got to give the Grots some credit for giving a go at making war though. They also have what looks like basically a land battleship almost, the Mega Tank perhaps equating to a medium-sized vehicle for other factions. There's a big track too, basically an Orc flatbed transport packing a decent amount of firepower. Again, maybe a datasheet that wasn't doing too badly until the latest edition of the Ork Codex, but was then a bit overshadowed after that. In terms of actual orc list building, I'd say perhaps the single most helpful thing that Forge World has is the War Boss on Bike, which is quite a meaningful choice in the Ork Codex, as it means that you can have a fast boss that can also take good relics. He could pick up Dakilla Claw and also reliably deliver it to where it's going to beat up the enemy's most important threats. I think the Bike War Boss is really quite a cool miniature as well, hefting a great big saw-bladed claw above his head, and fairly meaty as a character goes, but of course you are paying Forge World prices for him. £52 or $80 is pretty steep. They also have Knob Warbikers, which were a previous option from back in the 5th edition codex, but are unfortunately lacking rule support at the moment. I guess you could either just use them as squad leaders or representing regular warbikes if you wanted to, I guess. And they've got another Ork Big Mech on foot, a special character called Big Mech Buzgob, kind of looking a bit like an Orky Tech Marine with that axe and a sort of makeshift servo harness, plus a couple of grot attendants. Then to round off the Forge World bits, we've also got a couple of walkers, two big and stompy walkers in the Mecha Dread and the Mega Dread. They both come devoid of their arms, so you have to buy those separately. For those, they're basically taking a Dreadnought and making it bigger and stompier, with the choice of some scary guns that cost £24 each that you can see on the right. Finally, there's a fun Gretchen mounted artillery piece called a Super Cannon, and then some alternate bits that you could potentially mount on a Stomper. There's a Stomper head and a Lifter Dropper arm. I'll be honest, I don't know how easy they would be to mount on the current Stomper kit if you wanted to. I can't imagine it to be too hard though, with a bit of Orky ingenuity. So anyway, hope that you've enjoyed a bit of a tour through Games Workshop's Orky range, and talking a bit about the points values and the in-game strength of all the kits involved. Hopefully it's been at least somewhat useful, though if you think that I've missed any important details or there's any other good insights about the kits that I've missed, please let me know down in the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k guides coming. I'm hoping to do this sort of video for at least a few more factions as well, so let me know if you'd particularly like me to cover one thing next. Finally, if you have found the video useful, I would just like to mention the couple of ways that you can help support the channel and keep the videos coming if you'd like to. I do have that Element Games affiliate link down in the video description for discount Warhammer if you happen to live in the UK, and the channel also has a Patreon page as well, which is the main thing that funds the channel and allows me to make Warhammer videos as my main thing. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.